So we have set up this session to provide some information and support to all of you around the return to schools. I'm sure you will probably all know, but where we are is that shielding overall has been paused around the UK, although remains extended in a few small lockdown areas. Governments are planning a full return to schools, and that's already underway in Scotland. And we, following guidance from the CF Medical Association and the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, advice has been given that it's unlikely that children as a whole group will be asked to shield again. So we wanted to put this together to answer some of the questions that we know parents have had. We know for some this is a really positive step, and others are quite anxious about it. And we know there's also been questions from adults with CF who work in school and adults with CF who are parents of school-age children. So we'll do our best to cover what we can. We have asked for some questions in advance, so we'll be putting those to our panel. If we have time at the end, we'll be picking up any questions that you can submit to us on the chat. So we ask that you have your cameras and your microphones off, but you can use the chat function to send in any questions. Anything we don't get a chance to answer fully here today, we'll pick up over the next few days and provide some answers in a follow-up, either a blog or a piece on our website. So we will try and answer everything. So I'm going to just let the panel introduce themselves to you, and then we'll move on to some of the questions. So can we start with Gary, please?
Thank you, Becky. Good evening, everybody. My name's Gary Connett. I'm a paediatrician. I'm based in Southampton, and I'm one of the two paediatricians who also represents the Cystic Fibrosis Medical Association paediatric interests. So I'm pleased to be here this evening to join you all.
Thank you. And Charlie?
Oh, hi, I'm Charlie Dawson. I'm a paediatric CF nurse specialist, and I work at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And I've just retired as the chair of the UK CF Nurses Association.
Thanks. And Helen?
Hi, I'm Dr. Helen Love. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in the Paediatric Cystic Fibrosis Service at Nottingham Children's Hospital.
Thank you. And Joanna?
Hi everyone, I'm Joanna Barrett. I am a mum of four, two of whom have cystic fibrosis, and I'm a trustee of the CF Trust.
Thank you. And we're also hoping to be joined by Michelle, who's an adult CF nurse. She's had the same problems getting in as I had, so hopefully she'll be able to join us at some point in the call. So moving on to some of the questions that have come in to us, I think overall there's a question about whether the return to schools is the right thing for children with CF. Gary, can I hand over to you to talk through some of that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Becky. So we thought we'd start the session by just doing a little bit of context setting and just get some facts and figures out there upon which we can then base further discussion. So I'm just going to go through some of the data that we currently have and what we've learned about COVID-19 in the UK so far. So up until around now, about 1/3 people have been known to have had the infection, and around about 41,000 patients plus have sadly died of COVID-19. The vast majority of those who've died have been amongst the elderly, and in particular, sadly, it's been those in care homes where we've seen the excess mortality from this horrible infection. The figures, though, in recent times have been markedly decreased, and over the last 9 weeks, the mortality from the infection has been very stable at around 10 to 20 cases per day. And there's been no sign of any kind of a second wave in the country as a whole, despite the easing of lockdown measures that have occurred over successive weeks, as we try to get more and more back to normal, which I think has been very reassuring to us. Since the outbreak, we've learned that children with COVID-19 are far less likely to get severe disease compared than adults. Again, a very reassuring piece of information that's come through globally, and certainly the case in the UK as well. And children make up just about 3.7% of all the cases in the UK. You may have heard that some children have had a very rare so-called multi-inflammatory syndrome, a fairly unique complication to children. It has been a very small number of cases. Some of those children did go to intensive care units, but as far as we know, all those children have recovered completely without any long-term sequelae. Overall, we think that around about 70 to 80 children have been admitted to paediatric intensive care units across the UK. So a small number of children who've had the infection have gone to intensive care. And sadly, we know that 5 children, that's 5 children throughout the entire country, with all sorts of comorbidities in most of those patients, have sadly died. And to put that figure into context, if we think about influenza virus, and we know about the influenza virus infection that occurs each winter, last year was a typical year for that, and we saw 25 deaths of children from influenza infection. So COVID-19 so far in the UK has only caused about a fifth of that number of deaths. And remember that with influenza virus, those deaths have occurred despite the widespread uptake of vaccination protocols to try to prevent that infection. So that just gives a bit of a context about those sad, small number of cases where there has been a fatal outcome. Curiously, patients, particularly we know this from adult data where there's far more information, those adults with underlying respiratory conditions with things like asthma, for example, even severe asthma, those patients do not seem to do worse with COVID-19 infection compared to people who don't have asthma. We know about certain high-risk groups, but so far there's no strong signal that underlying respiratory conditions are associated with a worse outcome. We don't know that much specifically about cystic fibrosis people getting COVID-19 because very few people have had it. We know of about 30 cases reported through the Cystic Fibrosis Registry in the UK, held by the CF Trust, and with one sad exception of a person who had quite severe disease who unfortunately died, everybody else, as far as we're aware, have recovered and haven't gone on to have any significant long-term complications. So what does all that mean when we come to think about children going back to school? So there's 3, I think, important messages that we can take on board in thinking about the risks of doing this in the UK. The first thing is that children who are aged less than 12 years, we know get COVID-19 less than adults. They're less susceptible to the infection, it appears from the data, although teenagers are much the same as older adults. Children under 12 are less likely to get the infection. We do know, however, that all groups, and that also includes young adults, which has implications for young people going on to university and higher education, are much less likely to transmit the virus. And that's largely because they have less symptoms. The data so far suggests that amongst those children who've been shown to have COVID-19, only about 20% of those actually have any respiratory symptoms. Whereas in adults, the figures are far higher at around 70 to 80%. So that implies that the children have got less viral load, less virus in their bodies causing symptoms. And because they have less symptoms, less coughing, they're much less likely to have aerosol spread through droplets and through coughing to transmit the virus to other people. And we have very clear advice about people who do have respiratory symptoms staying at home. And then finally, we've got international evidence. And the Scandinavian countries in particular are quite interesting because you may know that many of those never closed their schools when the coronavirus was at its peak in their countries. And if we take Sweden, for example, which continue to have their schools open without social distancing amongst their pupils, they had no deaths. They've had no deaths so far amongst their 2 million population of children, which again, I think is very reassuring. And we also have data from other countries, places like Australia, Ireland, and Singapore, where before they closed their schools, there have been studies looking for evidence of significant transmission in the school environment. and they found very little. And also, I think reassuringly, particularly from Sweden, when they looked at their teachers, they showed that there was no increased risk of that particular profession having COVID-19 compared to other professions in that country. So all that, I think, has to be balanced against the negative effects of not going to school. And that's very much, as you'll be aware, to do with the physical and the mental well-being of our children, as well as them missing out on their education, and how that might then also lead to increasing inequalities. So I think that on this occasion, SAGE, the committee that gives the government advice about best practice, has got this right. And also, I think we can be further reassured by independent SAGE. I don't know if you've heard of independent SAGE, but these are another group of scientists who aren't paid by the government, but who are also assessing the data and making their recommendations about various aspects of easing lockdown. Now, that committee back in June advised against returning to schools at that time, when the prevalence of the virus was still at quite a high level in our communities. That advice was taken, and the schools didn't have widespread opening at that time. But that committee now also agrees with the government SAGE committee in saying that September should be a safe time to open the schools, given the very low continuing rate of the infection in our communities, which does not now pose such a significant risk. So that's the data as I understand it. And my take on that is it's quite reassuring in terms of the measures that are now being taken to reopen all schools for all pupils across the UK. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Gary. Joanna, could I hand over to you? You're in Scotland, so your children have been heading back to school in recent days. Could you talk to us a bit about your experience of them going back?
Yeah, sure. So my kids with CF are at primary school, so they're 8 and 6, and they've been back almost a week. And I suppose the message I want to give today is that so far it's been fine. They're travelling on school buses, they're in full classrooms with their teachers. I think my concerns before they went back were less CF specific and more, as Gary said, about their well-being. Shielding for 16 or so weeks was hugely isolating for them, and I could see that they were quite anxious about being in bigger groups beyond their household, which they'd become accustomed to. Certainly one of my sons was in particular quite sensitive to that as even family started to visit. But in school, they seem to be doing fine. There's lots of hand washing, lots of hand sanitizer. Lots of outdoor play and learning. They're trying to be outside as much as they can be in a Scottish summer. I think kids with CF, they're already highly attuned and aware of germs and of hygiene and the importance of that. And I think now it's really interesting that the rest of their peers are actually catching up with them, and that they're quite interested in this as well and quite aware. So that's been an interesting dynamic. I have got some concerns about what will happen if there's another local lockdown, or what if there's a full national lockdown, what will happen in the winter. They're now in school, so they might be more susceptible to the general bugs, and we're going to have to do second line meds, which we've not done for ages because they were at home. But to some extent, I think we're just going to have to live with some uncertainty, like we all have been doing for the last 6 months. But in the first week, certainly, it's been fine, and they seem happy to be there. And to some extent, I'm quite delighted myself.
I think many of us can share that slight feeling of delight. I just wanted to run you through what is the case in terms of whether attendance is compulsory or not. It's a bit of a varied picture around the UK, so bear with me if this is a bit of a list according to the countries. So starting in Scotland, where schools have gone back in full this week, the advice there is that attendance is compulsory unless there's specific medical reasons why someone shouldn't be at school. But things like fines and any action taken by schools or local authorities would only be used as a last resort. In Wales, there are no fines or penalties for non-attendance as specified in the guidance, but they expect to review this after the first half term. In Northern Ireland, they haven't really specified whether it's compulsory or not. There seems to be a little bit more flexibility. If children are medically advised not to be at school, then blended learning or home learning should be ready for them. And each pupil who has been shielding or lives with someone who's been shielding should have an individual risk assessment and advice from a consultant. And in England, attendance is compulsory, and all enforcement measures in theory could be used, so fines and all sort of associated measures that are usually in place around attendance will come back in from the 1st of September. The exception is if there is specific clinical advice for an individual child not to attend. What it doesn't say in the guidance is that that clinical advice has to relate to the child. So our understanding from that is, if you're in England and you're a parent of a child with CF and you're concerned about a risk to you, to discuss that with your clinical team. If they agreed that it was a significant risk, they would be able to write to the school and explain that, and children should then be supported to work from home. So the message there is just to be aware of the guidance in your nation, and we will make sure all of this is all linked to on our website anyway, and be able to, if you need it, get letters sent from your CF team or your child's CF team if they're not advising the child not to attend, just to make sure you don't end up with enforcement or fines, which I think is probably the last thing everybody needs. Coming on to the issue of parents who have CF themselves, or in particular something we've been asked a lot about is adults with CF who work in schools. I believe Michelle Fawcett has now joined us on the call, and she's an adult CF nurse. Michelle, are you able to join us? You may need to unmute, Michelle, if you're there.
Mute, there we go. Is that any better?
Marvellous. That's great.
Yes,
so Michelle, in terms of the advice that might be given to adults with CF who work in schools, is that something you're able to talk about?
Yeah, so we, in the northeast in Newcastle here, we have about 300 and odd patients, and a small number of those are teachers. And I've spoken particularly to one today who I'm not sure might be actually involved in this tonight, and I asked basically what had happened with her school and how it was going, because as far as guidance goes, we are kind of singing from the same hymn sheet, but it's more of a sense of what is each centre might differ. So what we're saying is it's up to the school to risk assess the patient, the teacher who is the CF patient, and what my patient sent me today was actually her risk assessment. So she is going to be going back into full teaching, but has an area at the front of the classroom where she'll be working from, and she's not to sort of step out of that box, if you will, and the children aren't to come into that space. That's adhering to the social distancing. She's been moved to a classroom where there's hard surfaces to allow for more stricter regular cleaning, reinforcing hand hygiene with the school children. But actually the feel that I'm getting is quite excited to get back to normal everyday life. And that seems to be sort of what we're encouraging, that it is good to get back to school as long as they are putting in the right provisions for you to feel safe. Like the guidance says, you know, they have to put these provisions in place, but that it needs to be risk assessed. And I think if there's anybody particularly having problems, I would suggest maybe union reps within the school to try and help advocate your case, that it's good to return back to work, but there is going to be some element of risk, but that needs to be taken into account. But that is mainly the advice that we're given at the minute, is to go back to work as long as there's the right provisions taken in place that make you feel safe and COVID secure as best as possible.
Great, thank you. I think that very much mirrors our understanding that across the nations, staff who have been shielding are expected to start to come back to work, but that workplace needs to be risk assessed, it needs to be COVID secure, and I think what you gave really good examples of was the reasonable adjustments that might need to be in place for people with CF. So we would consider people with CF as under the definition in the Equality Act as having a disability, and therefore being entitled to request reasonable adjustments. And I think for everybody with CF going back to work, they're really important. But I think CF team advice on what those reasonable adjustments should be for those individual people is really important.
I think the only one negative side to it perhaps is that patients might not necessarily be open and honest about their condition. It's not something, it's not a disability that's always clear to see. And I think then going into something where perhaps one teacher might differ from the next as far as risk assessment goes might then open up into more questions. So I think I think that needs to be taken into account, that this is something that some people don't particularly talk about or feel the need to share on a large scale, and this is obviously putting them under the magnifying glass a little bit more. So I think it's all about encouraging to be open and honest about the condition as well, and just saying, you know, there are risks, I'm at risk, still at risk here, and I think that needs to be acknowledged and supported as best as possible in the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. We have some quite detailed information on employment rights in relation to COVID-19 on the Cystic Fibrosis Trust website. We also have a more general fact sheet around work, and that includes some information to explain cystic fibrosis to employers. So if people are looking to sort of explain the general things about the condition, that might be helpful to them. Okay, so we've talked quite a lot there about the data, about the evidence, and about the guidelines, but completely understand that that doesn't, even hearing reassuring things and knowing what's in the guidance, doesn't take away the anxiety some people might be feeling. So Helen, I wondered if I could hand over to you to talk a little bit about how parents can deal with that anxiety both for themselves and for their children.
Sorry, you can see I'm not fast with this. Sorry, Becky. Yes, I mean, I guess this is a question that's coming up a lot for lots of people, families where children have CF, and actually for the wider population. I guess the first thing I wanted to say was just to normalise it, that worry and anxiety and uncertainty that families are experiencing is something that's totally understandable. And as a psychologist, I would be really concerned not to label it as anything more than a very normal reaction to a really unusual situation that we're all finding ourselves in at the moment. And adding, I mean, I say that, and I also am aware that families with young people and adults with cystic fibrosis will have additional concerns or may feel like their concerns are greater. I think in terms of managing anxiety, there are lots of things that we can all do ourselves individually and as parents, but as well as thinking about how to kind of model what do we do with worry when it's around in this way. I think one of the first things I wanted to say was just to reflect on the length of time that we are all living in this very unusual situation. And it's ironic that the government are telling us to be alert. And one of the things that psychologists talk about is that we have mechanisms emotionally, I guess the clearest way to say is emotional mechanisms. And at the moment, we are all very alert to worry and anxiety, and that makes things tricky for everyone. I think it is really important for families to be honest and open with each other, because I think when worry is around, sometimes it comes out in other ways. So you may be finding, particularly, here we are, we're what, March, April, May, June, July, August, 5 and a bit months into this experience. And I guess why I said this thing about it being very unusual, when we started in March, none of us knew how long this would be going on. And we're still in this position. We don't really know how long we're going to be living in the ways that we're living, and they are changing. But I guess the thing is, yeah, just to be open and honest about worry. For parents and adults in the household, if there's more than one adult in the household, I would be advising to share that with your partner rather than kind of swamp children with the worry. So finding time away from the children to talk about that worry, and also to have a way of being able to enable your children to talk to you about whatever worries. My concern is that young people don't always say, I'm worried, but they sometimes show that they're worried in their behaviour, and that for many families, after 5 months of being in close proximity all day, every day, we may not always be picking up on that, and that people might all be just a bit stretched at the moment. I know many families are doing amazingly, but just to be aware that if a child right now, we're thinking we've got 2 weeks in England where I'm sitting, we've got 2 more weeks to the end of time, and I know Joanna's experiencing children already going back to school, but the things that I would be looking for in little children at the moment will be more clinginess, more disruptive behaviour, more quickness to cry, worries about sleep or eating, all the things that we'd be looking out for normally. Does that make sense? And then going forward, I guess just to be thinking about ideas that psychologists talk about in terms of what we call our ACT approach, kind of an acceptance approach, knowing what we have control of and what we don't have control of. And families with cystic fibrosis are, I think, particularly brilliant and skilled at being able to do this already. So there are lots of skills that our families have that are relevant for COVID. So things like being particularly attentive to infection control and washing our hands and things like that are really important. Also being really good at living in the moment and knowing what can you be in charge of and how to get through that. So I think that things that help are knowing some of the stuff that Gary's been talking about, is actually some of the stuff that everyone's been talking about, to think about what's in place in your school, what have you got control of, what do you feel comfortable with. So if it's things like adapting how a child gets to school, you might think, actually, I'm going to feel more comfortable if I take my child to school than if I put them on the bus. That might be what you do to make you feel a little bit more secure. But equally, knowing that what you do might not be the same as what your friend on your chat room group does, and that that's okay. Someone else might be saying, I'm fine with them going on the bus. I don't need them to wear a mask. That's okay. I think it's about, as I said, working out what you feel in control with, and also knowing where you can go to for resources, for information. So going back to your CF team when you want to check on the facts and the information. I could talk about this all evening. I really don't want to hog the time. I guess as well, just thinking it's going to be different for different ages. I'm thinking about, as I said, like little ones might show their behaviour in different ways. Our adolescents some adolescents who I'm speaking to at the moment are really keen to get to school, want to get out. Ironically, like they've never been so keen to get to school because of the social aspect more than anything. And some of our young people who are very academic are really desperate to get in and wanting to get on with their courses that they feel like they're missing. I guess I would like to reassure parents and children who might be anxious about what their perceived negative experience of missing school might be. There's a massive amount of evidence that says if children have missed a long period of time, as our children have, they are not going to fall behind. I can't say that strongly enough. There's loads of evidence from New Zealand and America when we've had natural disasters and schools have been closed for a long period of time without online classroom resources, and children have reached their results haven't been affected by that chunk of time out. For little ones, they will learn to read. They will be able to do their maths. For children who are doing GCSE coursework, they will be able to do that. Okay, so I guess to reassure you that your children are resilient and are amazing learners. Speaking to educationalists, I know that a lot of schools are focusing their plan for the first few weeks and going back to school, and I'd be interested to hear what Joanna's experience is about well-being, not academics. Okay, happy children learn best, and schools are focusing very strongly on ensuring that children feel comfortable and safe back in their school environment. Okay, and many teachers and heads who I'm speaking to are saying that most young people are going to find, if they haven't already gone back, I know some schools, some year groups had a little bit of going back to school before the summer holidays, depending on what age group they had. And based on those year groups experiences and also what we knew before that, we know that most young people will find the first few minutes of going into school a bit weird, and they'll be told there'll be a one-way system in the canteen, or you've got to wash your hands more, or we're going to stay in a year group bubble, or we're going to do science in this building, or we're not having assembly. All these things that are going to be little nuanced changes, and within a very short time that will be fine for children. Schools are structured places that work within rules, and when schools change their rules, regardless of COVID, children are really good at falling in line with that. Okay, so don't worry about feeling behind too much. That no one's going to be behind, and we're all in the same boat anyway. And don't worry too much about the children's anxiety of getting in. It is like anything new. You're going to go over that lump, take a deep breath, jump off, and then within the first day, they'll be feeling okay. My worry is about children who may have had pre-existing experiences of worry and coping. And I think for children who may have other reasons why their kind of worry or anxiety feelers are more receptive, more alert, more upsetting, they might need additional support. And that's where people like psychologists in your CF team, people like support counsellors within school would be really, really helpful resources. But I cannot stress enough that for the vast majority of young people, going back to school is going to be fine. 2 more things to say, and then I will stop waffling, I'm sorry. I'm also really aware, and actually I think it's kind of good, don't tell anyone I think this, this is not in terms of the government guidelines or anything like that, but I just think it's quite fortuitous that children are returning to school when we would be returning to school anyway, after the summer holidays. So a lot of things that families are talking to me about, I keep kind of saying, yeah, wouldn't we be seeing that in September anyway? So teenagers who have been going to bed at 3 o'clock in the morning and getting up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I don't know if anyone's got any of those at home. Lots of people's sleep has been completely disrupted. They would probably be doing that over the 6-week summer break anyway. So don't worry too much about how I'm going to get Billy out of bed in September. You would be having that discussion anyway. And the reality is Billy will get out of bed and he'll have a hard time for the first few days, and then he'll be all right. Okay, so things that would normally happen at the end of the summer holidays are going to be happening again. Does that make sense? And then the other thing I just wanted to say about parents who are worried. I am really conscious that my job is not to tell anybody what they should or should not do. It is just to provide information and to help you decide what feels right for you. And I just think it is really important to hold on to what I call your kind of parental gut feeling. Okay, if your parental gut feeling is, I want to do things this way, then talk to the people around you who are your support mechanisms and work out a way of doing that. Does that make sense? That's not to dismiss anything else that we've heard, but I'm just also really aware that for some people, it kind of doesn't matter what anyone is going to say right now. That worry is going to be really hard. Last thing, and I said that was the last thing I wanted to say is in the next 2 weeks, if you're in England or Wales, just thinking about what you could do if you've got children who are nervous now, or if as a parent you are nervous. Between now and when schools go back, I would be just advising doing little baby steps of doing a bit more in terms of this easing of lockdown. So I know it's a continuum. We have some people who have been on planes and been on holiday, and we have some people who have literally just been to the post office at the end of their road. Find ways to make play dates in the park with your children, or going out or working out, if you feel comfortable going to a local shop with your mask on. If you're really finding it hard to come out of lockdown, start to do a little bit now in the next 2 weeks, because the first day of term, when you might be back in a school with 200, 300 people around, might feel overwhelming for an adult or a child. So just do a little experiment, maybe every day, right? What do we feel comfortable doing? Is that okay? I'll stop waffling, Becky, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you so much, Helen. That was really, really valuable stuff. We're going to move on to pick up on some of the questions that have come in. One of the key questions that we've had in has been about social distancing in schools, sizes of bubbles, how that will work. So you're probably aware that most of the guidance for the return to schools doesn't focus on children social distancing, particularly younger children, which I think for many of us feels a bit strange when we have been diligently keeping 2 meters away from everybody for a long time. The guidance for schools accepts that really that's not practical in a school, particularly for young children, and so focuses on the use of bubbles or groupings as a way to control any potential spread. So I know that has raised lots of questions for you about the size of those bubbles, about the approach to bubbles rather than social distancing. Gary, I wondered if you could talk about your thoughts about that. Oh, I think you're on mute, Gary.
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Becky. Yes, you make a very good point that it seems a little bit paradoxical that we've had this very clear advice about adults and environments to have social distancing with keeping apart from others, which is not as applicable within the school setting, and that seems a little bit paradoxical. That is a pragmatic approach, which is very much based upon what's achievable for everybody attending school and getting everybody back to school. And it's important to just reiterate the point that actually, although there's no absolute diktat about this, schools will be trying to maximize distance between children where possible. So it's not that they're completely ignoring that advice, it's just not pragmatic to do it to the letter. But the thing to say, I think, is that this is just one piece of advice, and there are many other measures which schools are currently risk assessing and putting in place, which are as if not far more important. The most important one in my mind, and I can't say it enough, is about hand hygiene and good hand hygiene practice. And I'm sure that all of the children are going to be subjected to very frequent gelling and washing of their hands regularly throughout the day. And that, to my mind, is one of the most important measures which will minimize the risks of virus transmission in the school environment. We've also got very clear advice about people who have illness suggesting coronavirus infection staying at home, enhanced cleaning arrangements in the schools, and engagement with the test and trace program. So there is a whole raft of measures which are being in place to mitigate against the limitations that can be done about safe distancing. Having said all that, we touched on briefly the idea of the bubbles. That was an invention that came out of Scandinavian countries, and I've already told you that those countries, in many cases, have kept their schools open throughout that time, and it appears to have been successful in trying to minimize significant spread of the virus in the school environment. And it's very much the view, particularly from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, that certainly the evidence so far tells us that children are not the drivers of the epidemic. That's not what's happening in our country, and that's not what's happened in the countries where schools have remained open throughout the worst times of this infection. So I think there's something about the school settings and transmission risk that's different to what we're seeing elsewhere in our communities. The school environment, and I think Helen touched on this, is a more regimented place where there are rules and ways of doing things. And on the whole, children are well behaved, and they're focused on being there for their education as their priority. And I think that environment of itself helps mitigate the risk of infection. And it's worth just reiterating that this virus is something that's behaving very different to other things that we know can be highly infectious in schools. It's not behaving like influenza has done, like things like head lice, which can spread very rapidly amongst children in schools, things like impetigo, which you may have come across, the staphylococcal infection, which can occur in the face and spread within children in schools. We're not seeing that kind of transmission so far in those places where schools have remained open. It's not the way that COVID is behaving. So I think we accept that there is some give and take in this, but overall the package of measures that's going forward in our country, I think, should be sufficient to ensure that children continue not to be a source of infection and drive the occurrence of further cases in our communities.
Thanks, that's great. So sort of following on from that, one of the questions that we've been asked is about the practical tips or things that parents could suggest to schools. Often I think schools have been asking parents what are the things they could do as part of the risk assessment to keep children with CF as safe as possible. I'll hand over to you, Charlie, because I know CF nurse specialists play a key role in that liaison with schools and making sure that they're able to support children. And I think what's really important here is this is obviously specific. We're talking today specifically about COVID-19, but we're really keen that children with CF on an ongoing basis have the support they need at school. And I guess this is a good opportunity to make sure that, as well as these kind of top tips for things that schools can do now, that children have the ongoing support that they need. So I'll hand over to you, Charlie, because I know this is your area of expertise.
Thanks, Becky. I mean, as you've already said, infection control in schools for cystic fibrosis is not something new. It's something for years we have been going to schools, teaching them about cystic fibrosis, the infection control risks, and what supports they can provide to all of the children that attend that school. So schools are quite used to knowing that we go in and we ask them to support our children. I would say with the current restrictions that are around and the current guidance that's around, the first thing that I would probably advise all parents is make sure you read the plans the school have put in place and familiarise yourself with them. All schools will have had to have risk assessed the whole school, not just the children with cystic fibrosis, the whole school. And they would have had to implement some control measures, as Gary's also spoken about. And the main areas they'll be looking at, the main headings they've looked at, is the hand and respiratory hygiene, the enhanced cleaning, and that's for the whole school now. It's not just the classroom environment that the child with CF has been in. The whole school is now going to have to be subjected to those enhanced cleaning measures. They also have to have plans for what to do if someone at school displays symptoms, and they also have to look at considering how they reduce contact. Now, that's not social distancing, it's about how they can reduce those large things such as assemblies, etc. So have a read about what your school's going to do, familiarise yourself, and maybe jot down some concerns you have and some questions you have around that. And then you can talk to your CF team about it, and you can also talk to the school, because there may be some subtle changes that they might be able to make if they're significant concerns. And those subtle changes might be little things like, if you were to feel your child would be better in a certain part of the classroom, I'm sure the school might be able to accommodate that. If you would like your child to maybe have a little bit more hand hygiene, the school will probably be able to accommodate that. They're not going to be able to put significant measures that will mean your child will be different to anyone else. And I'm sure Helen will agree with me, you don't want your child to be necessarily different to everyone else. With regards to practical advice, this is a good time to discuss the importance of hand hygiene with your child again. As we all know, children with cystic fibrosis, from as soon as they knew how to wash their hands, have been told to wash their hands. It'll be worth just having a quick review. Does your child wash their hands properly? Are they taking at least 20 seconds? There's some really good YouTube videos out there and some songs you can either sing aloud or in your head to make sure they're cleaning for 20 seconds, and normalize it. Make sure that your child's aware that it's not just them that's going to have to do it. Everyone is doing it. This is normal practice now. It's not just because they've got cystic fibrosis. We don't want to alarm them and raise concern that this is about CF. This is about what everyone's having to do to help control this pandemic. You can also just subtly tweak over the next couple of weeks, making sure that hand hygiene is really paramount, making sure that you're mimicking maybe what the school will be doing. You know, when you come back in from being outside, wash your hands. If your children have been playing outside, wash your hands before eating. That's what the school's going to enforce. So it'll be good to start getting the children ready to do this so that it becomes second nature to do it in school. Schools are really going to be promoting the catch it, kill it and bin it message. So again, you could discuss this with your child and just say, this is something that they're going to talk about in school, because it is around a cough, which is very prevalent, you know, when you're thinking about your child and symptoms that they may get. So explain what that means and explain that that's for everyone in the school, not just them with regards to cystic fibrosis. Encourage and remind them to cough into their elbow or into a tissue or into their hand, because everyone's going to have to do that, and explain that hand washing afterwards is really important. This is a time point for you to then maybe think about how you address this with the school. Does your child normally have a cough throughout the day? Is it something that's a common occurrence? And maybe discuss that with the school and talk about writing that in an individual healthcare plan. All children should have an individual healthcare plan in the school, so you can discuss and decide with the school how they're going to proportionally manage your child maybe having a cough. Making sure that other staff members know about this so they don't overreact to a cough. Also talking to your child and asking how they may want to, if another pupil in the class maybe questions why someone's coughing a little bit more than usual, maybe have a discussion with your child and maybe the school on how they can address that if something's asked, so that you're part of that process in how your child's potential cough may be managed, rather than actually it being over exaggerated or over managed. Enhanced cleaning obviously is another area. Again, read what the cleaning is for your school. You know, find out what they're doing. If you have any concerns or there's something you want them to maybe relook at, again, discuss it with the school. You may be able to write this again into the individual healthcare plan. If there's pieces of equipment that you would prefer your child to maybe have access to that not the whole school has access to, this might be something that your school will be able to provide for you. And just remind your child that everyone that's going back to school, there's going to be different things in place. There's going to be different rules. There's going to be different things they're going to have to do. Remind them that this is for everything, but how important it is to listen to those and adhere to those. Now, obviously, there's lots of discussion around social distancing. This is going to differ everywhere. And it also very much differs according to the situation and the resources in the school. So there's a lot of emphasis now on reducing contact. So again, you can prepare your child for the fact that there might not be so many group activities in terms of school assemblies, sports days, etc. You can prepare them for that, or you could basically just wait until they go to school. It's totally up to you what you want to do. But again, normalize it. Make sure they know this is for everyone. This isn't just for them, and this isn't just because of cystic fibrosis. Again, discuss any concerns with your school that you've read. If you've read anything on the plan that you're concerned about, discuss that with the school. Now, obviously, with regards to what to do if someone displays symptoms in the school, again, the school will have to have a very robust plan on what to do if anyone in the school, staff or a child, displays symptoms. So again, read up on that, and obviously any concerns you can discuss. Write down questions that you'd like to discuss with the school. This is an important time then to make sure that your child's individual healthcare plan is up to date with your contact details, because if they need to contact you to say your child's got a cough and they want to discuss that and whether that's something new, it's really important they've got the right contact details. They've got a second contact detail. And if it was that your child was asked to come home from school, it's important to identify if someone else will be picking that child up because you're maybe working or something. So just have a really good plan that you're comfortable with regards to contact and who will collect your child. Also, you know, it's not a problem to maybe have a think about if you were to be asked to have a test, maybe familiarise yourself with where in your area you would go and get a test and how you would organise that, rather than if suddenly you were asked to maybe have a test, you suddenly then frantically trying to find out where you've got to go. The main advice from everything I've just said really is read your school's individual control measures. Familiarise themselves with them, write down the questions you've got. All the schools will be going back, the staff will be back in school a couple of days before the children go back. You should have a chance to ring them, discuss your concerns, and maybe write anything into an individual healthcare plan that you have both agreed. Make sure your individual healthcare plan is up to date, and always ask your CF team for any advice and support, because we're always there to help you with that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlie. You've talked about individual healthcare plans quite a bit there. So my team at the Cystic Fibrosis Trust works on our helpline, and we find that those plans are a really important tool in resolving any issues at school and ensuring children have the support they need. For anyone for whom they are new, all children in England who have a medical condition at school should have an individual healthcare plan, which is held at the school and is put together by parents, teachers, and the CF team working together. In the other nations, it's less of a should, but it's still considered best practice in terms of supporting those children. And we have a template on our website. At the moment, we have a primary school template, which you could use in secondary school as well, but we're also preparing a specific secondary school template to come out soon. And really they should be done in sort of the first few weeks of every school year, and they should be reviewed annually. So for those of you in Scotland whose children have gone back, it's a good time now to be ensuring those plans are up to date. I know you've touched on it, Charlie, and I know one of the key questions has been around coughing and children with cystic fibrosis coughing at school, and how that might be perceived by teachers, or will that be an issue when we're told it's a key symptom to look out for in terms of COVID-19. Gary, did you have any thoughts on that, how we could support parents with that?
Yeah, it's a very key problem, and Annika just put a question up about that just now. So clearly it's a concern amongst many families as to what to do about this. And as we do know that children with cystic fibrosis do cough, and coughing can be normal, I think, for some children, and that isn't necessarily isn't going to be an indication that they have COVID-19 infection. What we do about this, I think, comes down to individuals and individual families and schools having a discussion about those and deciding what's best. I know that some children prefer not to share about their cystic fibrosis, and others are more open and upfront about it, and it's in the public domain amongst their peer group and their fellow pupils at schools. But certainly I think that if families are in agreement with this, there's no harm whatsoever in, I think, pupils being made aware that somebody in the classroom is going to have some coughing, which is normal for them, and it's not to be worried about, and it's not a sign of the COVID-19 infection. What I think we do have to think about, though, is what happens when a young person with cystic fibrosis has a significant increase in cough, or somebody with cystic fibrosis who doesn't normally cough has a new persisting cough, which is possibly going to occur over the winter period. I think with all the measures in place, the risks of those episodes are likely to be less. There's no doubt that the amount of infectious illness that we're seeing in paediatric practice across the board, with all the measures we've had in place so far with lockdown, has really impacted positively in the number and frequency of infectious illnesses. So I think that will have some knock-on benefits for people with cystic fibrosis, perhaps having less infections than might otherwise have been the case. But nevertheless, I think if that does occur, if there are new persisting coughs or increasing cough, which is significant and continued, then that young person has to stay away from school. And they should have a COVID-19 test, and they should follow the standard government advice about stay-at-home advice in relation to that, which is on the government website, about what to do in response to those symptoms, and in relation to the results of testing. My understanding is that if the test is negative and the symptoms resolve, and the patient is then well, then they're able to return to the school. One of course mustn't forget about the other important aspects of cystic fibrosis care in those circumstances, which include a prompt course of antibiotics to treat potential bacteria, which might and in fact is far more likely to be the cause of those symptoms. Does that sort of answer the question?
Yeah.
I hope so.
That's great, thank you. We are running a little bit over on time, but we started a little bit late. So we will continue for now, as we've got a few more scheduled questions that we'll cover. I think that means we probably won't get onto any of the additional ones that have come up in the chat, although I know some of them we've already been able to answer as we've been going along. So we'll make sure we follow up all of those, so they won't go unanswered. So we'll probably carry on for another sort of 10 minutes. If you do need to leave, and the panel, this doesn't apply to you, if you're listening in and you need to leave because you need to put the kids to bed or something, we are recording this, so you won't miss it. You'll be able to catch up later. We did have a question following exam results and what had happened with A-level results in terms of them being downgraded, and whether that would negatively impact particularly on children who perhaps had missed mocks or things like that. We hope that that's been resolved now with the changes to the grades. But what I would say there is that there's obviously going to be some differences in the way GCSEs and A-levels and exams across the UK happen in this coming academic year. So that's an area where it's really important that young people with cystic fibrosis do have the support they need. So if your young person with CF is coming into an exam year, it is worth discussing that with the school now about additional support. And this would apply in any year. It's just that we don't know exactly what the exam system is going to look like next year yet. But we would usually hope that individual healthcare plans would cover this, and that special needs coordinators, SENCOs at the schools, or their equivalent around the UK, who usually lead on this, are able to support children with CF who may need things like reasonable adjustments to support them to do their exams. So I think it's just something that we would look at every year, but particularly this year we'd want to have an eye on, as the system may be slightly different. So the other thing that sort of touches on schools, though isn't quite schools, is around young people who will be heading to university this year, or will be going back to university. So at the Trust we are preparing some additional resources around this, particularly around financial support for students and reasonable adjustments and their rights. But overall, we've had some questions about whether the return to university and starting university is safe. So Gary, I wondered if you could just briefly give your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think we haven't as yet got clear guidance from the government in relation to universities, and that is still awaited. And I think that partly reflects the fact that universities are autonomous bodies which act independently and make their own decisions in their own best interests and those of their staff and their students. But in exactly the same way as schools employ their staff, universities will have the same legal responsibilities to act in meeting the health and needs of their students and their staff, and they should be going through exactly the same type of risk assessment process to minimise as far as possible the risks of COVID-19 in their environments, in the same way as schools have been doing. But as yet, there's no specific guidance on that, which is, I'm sure, in preparation and still awaited. What I would say is that a lot of what I've said so far about the data relating to teenagers and young people does extend into early adult life. So the data about the decreased risk of transmission, decreased viral load, less occurrence of symptoms is also the case in young adults. I think also what we've seen in terms of easing of lockdown has been a significant amount of mixing of young adults in our communities, and that so far outside of the school environment has not resulted in a significant upswing or any suggestion of a second wave as a result of easing those measures, which I think gives us a measure of reassurance about what's likely to happen in the university setting.
Right.
But as I say, it's still work in progress.
Thank you. And I think a common theme across children going back to school, across people going back to work at schools, and students going back to university, for us at the Trust in terms of empowering people with their rights, is around reasonable adjustments and making sure that people have individual advice from their CF team when appropriate, and that employers or places of learning are aware of their duty to make those adjustments to ensure equality of access and equality of work. So that sort of brings us to the end of most of our questions, and I think Gary, you've been able to pick up on some that have come in, and we will pick up on some that follow. I know that one other that came in was around sports and extracurricular activities for children at school, which obviously for children with CF, physical activity is really important. Charlie, I wondered if there was anything that parents should be aware of, or if for CF nurses you're sort of happy for generally for children who with CF to be resuming normal sports activities at school.
Well, I mean, as you said, physical activity is so important, and it does provide the opportunity to have treatment in a normal way, you know, that all the other children are as well. And again, I think it's the same as with the schools. I mean, any extracurricular activities or any specific sports clubs or children's after school clubs will have had to have completed a risk assessment and will have had to initiate some control measures. So it should be the same thing. If families would like their children to go back to an after school club, then it will be to speak to that club, find out what they're doing, and then have a discussion around any concerns you've got. So I don't think it's something that we should say definitely no to, because I don't think that the after school clubs will be doing anything very different that schools are doing. They will be following you know, the guidance that's out there. They would have risk assessed, and they would you know, have specific control measures in place. So if it's an important part of your child's socialization, being with friends, they love it, they enjoy it, they want to do it, and you feel that the control measures in place are good enough, or you've raised your concerns and they've been addressed, then I think it's something to definitely consider going back to.
Great, thank you. And I know there's been a few questions about risk assessments and whether you should be able to see those. You certainly should be able to see. You should be able to see risk assessments, particularly for schools, if you want to. And risk assessments across the UK do need to take into account children who have been shielding, and in some cases they've been specifically been asked to take into account children who live with someone who is shielding. So you're certainly well within your rights to talk to your schools and talk to those groups and say, can we have a look at the risk assessment? So I think just to pick up on one last sort of theme of questions that I've been seeing coming in has been around masks. And Gary, I hope you don't mind if I pass this one over to you. I know I did some research today about the situation with masks on public transport and dedicated school transport. So we can certainly provide that as a sort of backup answer in terms of what the guidance says. But if I could hand over to you to kind of give the medical opinion on masks, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not an expert on masks, I must say, and I'm vaguely aware that the advice does vary between the devolved nations, which I hope you might have more the finger on the pulse with regards to that. My understanding is that masks are certainly in the way that they're being recommended in shops and public places and public transport is more to do with protecting others from the virus that you might have, particularly if you have a cough, rather than them being particularly effective in minimizing the risks of people picking up the infection from others. So I think from the context of our young people with cystic fibrosis, there's little to be gained from them wearing masks. And again, we've heard a lot this evening about all the other measures which have been recommended, which I think are probably far more important than the relative benefits of wearing masks. The issue with regards to the masks on the school bus, that again I think is a difficult one, but a risk assessment should be made about the use of that bus and how the risks of infection transmission occurring being kept as low as possible should have taken place. And again, it goes back to those things we've already been hearing a lot about from people like Charlie, to do with the hand washing, the use of an alcohol gel before and after boarding a bus, which is probably far more important than wearing a mask on the bus in a school bus. I don't know if you have any further details, Becky, that you might want to come back on.
In terms of the school transport?
Well, I think in terms of masks generally, I think it is a tricky one, and I think taking up Helen's point, some people might feel more comfortable wearing a mask as a teacher in some situations, and I think that's not necessarily wrong, but and I'm aware that other European countries have had different practices and policies on masks. The evidence is very divided. And the risk benefits about behaviour changes, which may or may not be advantageous from wearing masks, is also talked about. I think it was important when the virus was at a very high level in our communities, and perhaps we were a little bit late in wearing masks more generally in society. But now that the underlying risk of infection is very low, I certainly wouldn't be advocating for masks in the school environment in many settings. Helen, you got the point there about that?
Yeah, I'm just really linking to what you said and what Charlie said earlier. Again, it might be worth going back and looking at the documents that your schools are providing, what their plans are, and finding out what they're saying. So I know, for example, that some schools are saying children don't have to wear, well, all schools are saying they don't have to wear masks, but they may have written in it's okay if they choose to, and similarly for staff members. And also just again I'm thinking about little children and their understanding, just to warn them that many schools, their guidelines in terms of PPE when children hurt themselves mean that some teachers who will have to not socially distance in order to attend to a little kid who's fallen over, they may well have to wear a mask. That might be the school's guidance at that point. I don't know what the rules are about that. Charlie might know some more about that. So again, just warning young children not to worry if their teachers are wearing masks in some circumstances and not in others. I guess thinking about how the children perceive people wearing masks as well, if that will fuel their worry or make them feel more comfortable. I think we are seeing masks in lots of everyday places, so children will be familiar with them. But I think, as you're saying, it's not needed at school. But if that's what somebody feels that they want to do to feel comfortable, that's their choice. That makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. And we do have a general Q&A on masks on our website as well, so that might be worth a look for some general information. I'm going to bring us to a close shortly. I think I just wanted to highlight, because I know I've seen a few questions come up in the chat from people with CF who work in schools. So I thought I'd just highlight what the government guidance says, because it is slightly different across the UK. I think the most important message from us as the Trust is that we would encourage you to have individual conversations with your CF team. Perhaps first speak to the school to see what measures they're planning on putting in place, what the risk assessment has said. Discuss that with your CF team, decide together if that is going to work, and if not, look at what reasonable adjustments together you would suggest to the school. So the guidance is slightly different across the UK. Again, this is one of my lists of of guidance around the UK. So this is specifically for staff who have been shielding. So in England, the guidance says that staff can now return to the workplace, providing the guidance for schools is followed and a risk assessment has been done. So reasonable adjustments are going to be important there to make sure that you get what you need. Ideally, 2 metre distance between pupils and staff should be maintained, and where not possible, time spent at 1 metre distance should be minimal. So in terms of what you actually plan as reasonable adjustments, I think you'd be looking at in your job role, is that 2 metres realistic? If not, what adjustments does the school need to do to make sure you can follow that? In Scotland, it's fairly similar. It does refer to if you can't distance, wearing face coverings. So again, that's going to be an individual discussion with your CF team about whether that's right for you, whether that's an appropriate adjustment, or whether there's something else that you need. In Wales, staff who have been shielding can return if the workplace is COVID secure, but should be able to work from home if possible. So it's a little bit different to the other areas. And finally, in Northern Ireland, if staff are unable to work from home, they can return to the workplace, but they should have an individual risk assessment. And it specifically says that also the partners and family members of people who have been shielding who work in schools should also have an individual risk assessment. We will write all this up. Much of it is already on our website, along with employment rights information that we're updating this week, but we will include it in the Q&A when we finish off. This week, we've added specific new information that we've worked on with the CF Medical Association about return to schools to our website. So you can take a look at that to follow up this meeting. And this has been recorded, so you'll be able to replay it if there's anything that you think of that you wanted to look at again. Our helpline team are on hand if you need to ask questions or just need someone to talk things through. We can't give medical advice, we can't give individual advice, but we can support you to look at what the guidance is, what your rights are, and sort of understand how that applies for you. And I just really want to say a huge thank you to our panel who have been brilliant, and thank you to everybody who has joined us today. I really hope this has been useful wherever you are in the UK, and hope it supports you and your families in the weeks ahead as everybody settles into the return to school. Thank you all so much.